Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we're here for part 6 of a 15-part series as we travel room by room through Stephen King's The Shining. This video is on chapters 18 through 21, pages 222 through 292. So what happened in this portion of The Shining? Chapter 18, known as the Scrapbook. And this is, for me, kind of where Stephen King goes Stephen King. He stops telling the story and starts telling every story. Stops telling the story, starts telling every story. Jack has been spending some quality time with a scrapbook that he found in the boiler room, and he has found that the Overlook Hotel has an even more sordid history than he had previously imagined, including mob connections, which may still persist to this day, and that makes him angry, very angry. And you wouldn't like Jack when he's angry, which is probably a television show that would have been on Jack Torrance's television at some point. Chapter 19 is titled Outside 217. Danny approaches 217, the notorious room that he was told to stay away from, and he decides better of the venture altogether. But as he is leaving, the old-fashioned rope-style fire extinguisher, hose-style fire extinguisher at the end of the hall falls off its hook, and this is our first poltergeist-level manifestation. Maybe. Chapter 20 is Talking to Mr. Ullman. Jack starts having symptoms similar to a hangover, similar to a jonesing, similar to a relapse. And he works himself up to calling Mr. Ullman and threatening to write an expose about the Overlook because he feels somehow slighted over the information that he has since learned. Chapter 21, Uncle Al calls. See, let me ruin the audio real quick. Did that suck? I hope so. Al is a majority shareholder in the Overlook Hotel. I think it was majority or minority shareholder. I'm not quite sure, but I'm going to go with majority shareholder because it sounds stronger. And even though he was that shareholder, he had to pull some special strings to get a guy like Jack a job. This conversation ends poorly, as it is basically Uncle Al threatening Jack, "Don't write the story, you son of a bitch. I got you this job, I brought you into this world, and I can take you out of it." And Jack, in the aftermath, is a big, brooding ball of anxiety and anger. Danny picks up on this and fears that his dad is going to send him to the loony bin. I mean, we've all been there. So what is there to talk about in this subset of chapters? The very first thing that I noticed in this set of chapters that was interesting, perhaps on a thematic level, is when Wendy and Danny have gone off on their hike, and Jack is in the boiler room, and he is looking through this notebook, this scrapbook of old newspapers. And it's very interesting. He's digging through the past. And Wendy and Danny took a hike to the abandoned sawmills. In this moment, both of them are basically brooding in the past. Both sets of, all three characters, both sets of individuals. Jack by himself, Wendy and Danny off on their hike. Wendy and Danny are going off into nature to see the abandoned sawmill. The industrialized but defunct sawmill. Something that was a symbol of the future and is now a symbol of the past. Whereas Jack is brooding in the past with this notebook, this scrapbook of old newspaper clippings in the boiler room. The boiler being a way which, even in 1977, was fairly defunct for heating buildings, at least to my understanding. This is the internet, so obviously someone's going to call me out and tell me I'm wrong for that eventually. But it is interesting that they are both... Jack is stuck there. He is immersed in this prehistory, the pre-Torrance history of the hotel. While and whereas Wendy and Danny are simply going out to see it and then come back. Why is that necessary? We are already losing Jack. To what are we losing Jack? It sound like one of those old ACT questions, the standardized test questions. We're losing Jack to the past, to the history, to the ghosts, to the hauntings, to those nasty things that go bump in the night. Perhaps that is certainly one way of looking at it. What do we know about Danny and Wendy? Well, all mothers have some touch of The Shining, and Danny is The Shining embodied. What is The Shining? For the most part, The Shining has been shown to us as being able to see the future. Wendy and Danny are going out to see the past, that sawmill, but to keep moving with their lives. Jack was left by Wendy and Danny while in the boiler room, and they're coming back to him still in the boiler room. He's already being abandoned in the past. And even when his wife comes to retrieve him, she's got some sandwiches, don't you know? He wants to get into some of that rapscallion that is buried deep inside of him, don't you know? Even when she comes to retrieve him, he lies to her. He is having symptoms of relapse. He is moody, he is angry, and he has to cover it up very quick because he catches himself getting testy. So I thought that that was interesting. Here on 227, he could almost see them in the dining room, the richest men in America and their women, tuxedos and glimmering starched shirts, evening gowns, the band playing, gleaming high-heeled pumps, the clink of glasses, the jocund pop of champagne corks. The war was over, or almost over. The future lay ahead, clean and shining. America was the colossus of the world, and at last she knew it and accepted it. And later, at midnight, Derwent himself crying, "Unmask, unmask." The masks coming off, and the Red Death held sway over all. Wow. The Mask of the Red Death. One literary giant referencing another. This is one of the truest ways that an author can tell another author, I love you, and your work has inspired me to do the work of my life, to do the work that I love, to do the work that truly inspires me. Carrying on the page, he frowned. What left field had that come out of? That was Poe, the great American hack, and surely the overlook, this shining, glowing overlook, was an invitation he held in his hands, was the furthest cry from E.A. Poe imaginable. Oh, never mind. Never mind. Just thought that was interesting. To go ahead and put that out there and then take it away like that, you can't do that. Give me 1 second here. I'm sure this is compelling entertainment. I put something in my notes and I don't know what it means. I looked this over before I turned the camera on. Oh, okay, yeah. So he put the invitation back and turned to the next page. This is still on 227. A paste up from one of the Denver papers scratched beneath it the date May 15th, 1947. May 15th, 1947. On the next page, Derwent, who makes no secret of having sunk more than $1 million into his newest venture, and some may say the figure is closer to $3 million, says that, quote, the new Overlook will be one of the world's show places, the kind of hotel you will remember overnighting in 30 years. The kind of hotel you will remember overnighting in 30 years later. In 1947, this clip of the newspaper, well, the clip is not directly, the quote is not directly from this previous date, but they are held back to back in the notebook. That the Red Death Party happened May 15th, 1947. Then you get the quote from Derwent saying this is the type of place you're going to remember having stayed in 30 years later. The only date we've got there is 1947. And here, at the front of The Shining, copyright 1977 by Stephen King. Is that foreshadowing? This is the exact year after, the exact year, 30 years after that party, when we've got a quote telling us 30 years later. So there is also the bit about Jack here on 231. I think it might happen one time earlier in this chapter, but I didn't catch it then. He wiped his mouth constantly with his hand as he turned the pages. This mannerism of wiping his mouth, drooling too much, mouth watering, this Pavlovian response is something that we had only previously seen in connection with his drinking habit. Here, in this quote, it is linked with the scrapbook and writing. And later on, as this chapter turns into 19 into 20, we start seeing Jack wipe his mouth when he starts thinking about writing, not drinking. A true Pavlovian response, because we've removed the response from that thing which is desired. We've removed it from the drink. The drink freed him to write. The writing freed him essentially from responsibility. Here he is thinking not of the drink, but of the writing, and getting that Pavlovian response mechanism where he's just a drooling too much. So I think that is certainly something to watch moving forward. On 233, the hotel had been closed for the rest of the decade. There was a single story about it. A Sunday feature headlined "The Former Grand Hotel Sinking into Decay." The accompanying photos wrenched Jack's heart. The paint on the front porch was peeling. A lawn, bald and scabrous, a bald and scabrous mess. Windows broken by storms and stones. This would be a part of the book, if he actually wrote it, too. The phoenix going down into the ashes to be reborn. He promised himself he would take care of the place. Very good care. It seemed that before today he had never really understood the breadth of his responsibility to the Overlook. It was almost like having a responsibility to history. Is this the assumption of our Savior into the flowery clouds above? Is this Jack finally assuming and giving in to his place with the Overlook? I think that's what we're left to imagine. I think that's what we are left to assume. And I think that is certainly what's being written down. On 234, he rubbed his lips and turned to the next page in the scrapbook. He was in the last third of it now, and for the first time he wondered consciously whose book this was, left atop the highest pile of records in the cellar. So it's got all of these, this notebook has all of these ancient stories about the Overlook, but it's left on the top of all of these papers and boxes and records in the cellar. Whose notebook indeed? This notebook is a notebook that spans a generation, 2 generations, and here it is, in full glory. We don't hear much disparaging the condition of the notebook. It's all obviously still readable for Jack. Whose is it? Who put this together? I think we are left as the reader to assume it belongs to the hotel itself. Herein, the hotel being a character in and of itself, separate from, and perhaps in opposition to, our protagonists. The next thing I have written down here, before I get to what I think is the main thrust, on page 268, he closed his eyes and tried to imagine telling Wendy, "Guess what, babe? I lost another job. This time I had to go through 2,000 miles of Bell telephone cable to find someone to punch out, but I managed it." That's just a hell of a quote. I think that gives us not quite the best insight to Jack's character that we get from these 4 chapters, because I think that the next thing I have to talk about is the best insight that we have to him. But that derelict sense of humor that is not quite a black sense of humor, but definitely self-deprecating, I think is a very good glimpse into the heart of Jack Torrance, because he's a screw-up, sure, but he loves his son, and he loves his wife, but he's really violent and he's got a drinking problem. But he's good-natured enough to make fun of it himself. Doesn't that count for something? Oh, doesn't it? And I think that is a real small glimpse into the heart of a person. Self-deprecating humor is something that is, first off, it takes a level of self-awareness that is not average, that is above average. It also takes someone who is able to admit faults. Jack seems on both of those levels. Jack seems to be a 3-dimensional character in that way. But I think the true meat of the matter here comes to us from page 277. After Jack had found the information about possible mob connections with the hotel, after Jack had walked, where did he call Ullman from? He walked to town, right? I'm not remembering right now. But anyway, he had found a way to call Ullman. Yeah, he walked to town and called Ullman from town, because he didn't. If he had called him from the hotel, he would have had his phone number, but he had to ask for the operator. But he called Ullman, gave him a piece of his mind, threatened him some more, apologized to him sort of, and then, for good measure, threatened him again. So we've got that. Then, very shortly after, we've got Jack beating himself up for it, which makes sense. I don't know how many of you have gone off on a boss, but you often do that pretty shortly thereafter. And then we get the call from Uncle Al. And in the aftermath of that, or no, it's in the middle of that actually. It was more than a game, Al. It's easier for you. You don't have to take some rich friend's charity. You don't need a friend in court because you are the court. The fact that you were one to step from a brown bag lush goes pretty unmentioned. The fact that you were one to step from a brown bag lush goes pretty much unmentioned, doesn't it? And here, I think, is the true heart of the matter. In today's defunct and derelict discourse, I think that this would be written off as white fragility. But we needn't find some title for it so fancy as that. This is a case of pride. Jack is a prideful individual. To this point in the story, we've got a lot more of Wendy's backstory than Jack's, from what I can remember, and it's been a long time since I've given this novel a go, so I do not remember what comes after this point. But Jack seems to think fairly lowly of himself, and he seems to want to write that off as projections from someone else, sort of suggesting that Jack does not come from a very good household himself. That's right. We do get the one memory of Jack from childhood, of his father smacking him around a little bit, and then going back to watch television, because, hey, that's what dads do, right? And in the wake of that, Jack not feeling very great about himself, because he probably didn't have a great upbringing himself, he's a very prideful individual. He does not want to have to take handouts from his rich buddy Al, that, by the way, is only his rich buddy Al because they were both drunkards. And by the by, Jack is still known as a drunkard. Why? Because he's not rich. And when a rich guy goes ahead and kicks the habit, he's just the rich guy still. But Jack, who used to be a drunk and now is not, is former drunk Jack Torrance. Former drunk and always violent Jack Torrance. Which is probably fair. Jack is violent. Jack does still have outbursts as if he were a drunk. But he is not a drunk. And he is prideful and unwilling to yield to the fact that he is still the town drunk. But that is it. That is all I have to talk about in this selection of the chapters from Stephen King's The Shining. I hope to see you back here next week for episode 7, which is over chapters 22 through 25, pages 292, through 321. And maybe you found a little bit more to talk about in these chapters than I did. And if you did, I would love to hear from you in the comments below, because I didn't get a whole lot besides character work out of these chapters. And again, like I said, for me, in that first chapter especially, this is where Stephen King's got a terrible habit of, and I think people who are infatuated with Stephen King would be more than willing to admit this, stop telling the story and start telling every story. And I think perhaps a little bit of Booger Sugar is to blame for that if you've read any of his autobiographical stuff. But the habit of bringing up every story that ever could be is something that really sort of derailed that first chapter for me. But anyway, if you want to help me out here, hitting that like button really helps me in the YouTube algorithms. If you want to share this on some form of social media, that really, really helps me out. And if you really, really, really love me, there is, as always, a link to my Patreon to be found in the description below.